So the
education.
number of institutions we have is not relevant. I mean, as of 2011, we had about 117 universities, and I think there are more right now. We have the petroleum training institutions in Warri, we have in Kaduna, we have specialized institutions, so to speak. So what you're saying is not important, or it's not as important, the number of institutions as regards the products that come out of it.
If you have a lot of institutions, that is a good thing, because in a country where we have 170 million people, the more schools that we have, the more educational penetration you will have across the country. It will improve access. People do not have to leave Kaduna to come to Lagos to study, except they want to do so. So in terms of penetration and access, the number of schools that you have are important. But in the final analysis, what counts is the quality of education you get wherever the educational institution is cited. So even if you have a University of Science and Technology and you don't have the kind of quality manpower training happening there, people may have access to the institution, all right, in terms of presence. But then what will count in the final analysis will be what kind of education happens there. If people are in the Department of Computer Science, what is the quality of manpower that they have in terms of teachers that teach there? Are they well remunerated? Do they conduct research? Do they go for seminars and rub minds with their counterparts across the world? What about the quality of pedagogy, the quality of teaching and learning that happens in those places? Those are the things that will finally count in terms of the quality of education that we give. So if you are talking about the number of schools, that's fine in terms of access and penetration, but then we need to worry more importantly about the quality of teaching that happens there. And my sense is that we need to do more in terms of improving that quality. It could mean to incentivize research. It could be to make sure salaries are promptly paid. It could be to make sure that there are constant regulatory visits to know exactly what is happening. In law, for instance, we see that the NUC and other regulatory bodies tend to go from one school to the other to know how many people are sitting in one class, what kind of quality of teaching happens there, and they impose specific limits. I think we need to have that kind of stronger regulatory oversight to make sure that standards are monitored very closely.
But in spite of that, one wonders, because year in, year out, you see JAMB, in spite of all these commissions that we have, rather than raise the cutoff mark, sometimes you hear that the cutoff mark is reduced and you wonder, what's going on? Are they not supposed to keep increasing that? Because the level is supposed to be very competitive, but that's not what we see.
Yeah, what that has to do is, these are standardization tests where people write certain exams before they qualify to enter into certain institutions. And you find out, the test scores tend to move up and down from time to time. And sometimes the standards, to share your concern, sometimes the standards are abysmally low, and you wonder if these people eventually get into the school, what kind of education will they possibly, do they have even the basic, the preliminary skills to function within such a rigorous learning experience? You find that the standards sometimes are lowered for all kinds of reasons. But again, what will matter is the quality of learning that happens there. I am looking for situations where people don't have to come from out of universities or any kind of center of learning and then be concerned about how they will get jobs. Because, you see, there will always be job deficit. There will always be people who won't get jobs if they are merely looking for jobs. So the logical extension of what I'm saying is that we need to build the capacity in such a way that if a person comes out of the university, comes out of the College of Education, comes out of polytechnics or whatever centers of learning, they ought to be self-employed. They ought to be able to say, look, rather than wait to get a job, I ought to be able to create jobs. And that is what happens and that is the emphasis in most countries. How can people create jobs rather than wait to be absorbed in certain institutions? Because eventually what they will find is that 2-3 years upon graduation, they don't get jobs. And then, we have this kind of crisis. I think that we need to find a way to build capacity in such a way that people will have confidence to say, look, if I cannot get jobs, I've got sufficient training to create jobs, not just for myself, but for everyone. And I think that is where the knowledge economy comes in. We should move away from simply relying on raw materials, but to say, look, what kind of knowledge do people have and how can they add value to society? Meaning be able to not only create jobs for themselves, but create jobs for those who were interested in what they do.
I believe that, we might soon be going for the headlines, but, just so you have it in mind, we'll talk about the role of funding. Considering that we've always seen, this brickbat between, the public now and, the government on one hand, but, there's also the private sector that doesn't seem to have any regulation, and then the outflowing of many Nigerian students, to other countries looking for funding, education,
yes,
but are willing to pay.
Yes. Yes, if we have a funding crisis. UN, for instance, says there's a minimum amount of funding that must be provided in national budgets for education, 26%. But in Nigeria, not only do we not get that, there is also a difficulty in knowing whether budgetary allocations are actually implemented. This is August. We're already in the 8th month of the year. In some states, I suspect that educational investment has been less than 10% or 20% of the budget already. This is the 8th month. So to have the budgetary allocation is one thing. To have that enforcement ability is another thing. And there seems to be this gulf between conceptualizing an idea and actually implementing it. The fact that Nigerians are living in droves to India, to the US and other countries tells us that there is a systemic crisis with our educational system here. And I think this is something that calls for a lot of concern from all stakeholders, from government to private sector to teachers, parents and all kinds of stakeholders.
When Dr. Wale Babalakin, who was then the chairman, Committee on Pro-Chancellor, said that Nigeria spent about 160 billion naira for about 75,000 Nigerian students who were schooling in Ghana. And in 2011, our budget was not up to 160 billion naira, the entire budget. And so it shows that, look, we're spending more in those countries. Nigerians want quality education, no doubt. But we don't seem to have identified that, look, this is as serious as much as we're losing so much money to other economies. Even in West Africa here, now people are going to Togo to seek this education. And you ask yourself, have we gone that bad?
Yeah, the question actually is not so much about how much we spend in terms of what appears to me to be education tourism. People are going on education tourism in other places. The more fundamental question is, why are they living this much? It wasn't like this in the 60s. It wasn't like this in the 70s. It wasn't even like this in the early 80s. So there has to be a very serious study concerning why are people living. Look, in the 70s, it used to be scandalous to come to Nigeria with a medical certificate from Asian countries, India, Pakistan, and the rest of them. But today, Nigerians go to India for all kinds of medical purposes. So what that tells us, that something is fundamentally wrong. There's nothing wrong with us as Nigerians. There's nothing wrong with our climate. There's nothing wrong with our skin. There's nothing wrong with us. What is wrong is the failure of the institutions that we've put in place. And this is happening right before our eyes. I told you I've been in the sector for 20 years, and I've seen a very steady decline in the quality of students that are admitted, in the quality of students that we meet in the universities, in the quality of writings and dissertation researches that we are seeing across the board over 20 years. There used to be this debate about whether the quality of education was rising or falling. Now there is no such debate, because apparently the verdict is saying, everybody recognizes that the standards are falling. Now, if standards are falling, the next step would be to ask, what can we do? And you would expect that those who are leaders in our system, political leaders, will raise this matter to the level of discussion that it deserves. And so far, 8 months to a major national election, there is no debate about this. We don't even know who the candidates are. We don't even know who the presidential candidates are across the parties, in order for all kinds of stakeholders to raise these issues for debate. So what that tells us is that there is a lot of neglect of the sector. And this is a very strategic sector that affects the future of this country. Because those who are in secondary schools now will be, in another 10, 15 years, those who will be directors, managers in all kinds of companies. And what they do, how they manage those institutions, will be a direct reflection of the quality of education that they get, that they got in the first place.
But I heard some people say that, that if we really want, we cannot talk of very good education or qualitative education without speaking of funding. And that, for us to be able to realize the quality that we're looking for, the government might not be able to make it alone. And that, we have to see how other people, parents, stakeholders who be involved. There are private schools now, they too have, gone into that sector as well. How we can also tap into that and ensure that there is, will I say, even ground across board. So whether or not you're going to a private or government school, there is a minimum quality standard that you're assured of. Have you seen commitment across board from the side of government especially? Because we've noticed that in government schools, whenever the talk of funding comes up, it's always a very tough one.
Yes, it is a tough one. We do not get the kind of committed expenditure that we should get for a sector as strategic as this. I told you that UN, for instance, has suggested that, look, why don't you have 26% of national budgets focusing on education? We need to have even more of that in developing countries like ours, where we have extensive manpower deficit. But you don't get that kind of funding.
Do you think it's something, that figure, do you think it's something that is truly, because there have been debates as to whether or not that figure came up. There were even denials that that figure ever came up in any, UNESCO summit.
Well, but you see, in the last analysis, you don't even need the UNESCO or any
exactly. So the question will be whether or not it came up. Do you think that it's a figure that is feasible? We do know in the past, last year or so, that education actually got a bigger budget than security in Nigeria.
Yes, but you see, as I was saying, it's not even enough. It's not even material whether UNESCO suggested these figures or not. Out of interest, we ought to know that, look, we don't need any government or any UN agency to tell us how much to spend on education. We need to know that, look, education is something we need to invest in. Now, concerning the question of funding, if we make certain specific budgetary allocations, the kind of immoral economy of corruption that we have could mean that even what is budgeted is not properly managed. So we have issues here concerning, first, inadequate funding, and then proper, transparent, accountable management of the resources that are allocated. My experience in the university system, I'm sorry to say, is that most vice chancellors tend to see allocations to their universities as their private entitlement. And you don't get that kind of transparent, accountable process, even in terms of managing inadequate resources. So it's not enough to lament about funding. Funding will always be a problem. Even in the US, there's a lot of debate about how they can fund more research and development projects. But then what kind of transparent and accountable process do we have? Even in those, especially public schools. Private schools, have their own infrastructure of accountability. But in the public schools, do we have that sense of transparent management of resources, inadequate as they may be? My experience tells me that we can improve in terms of how much has been received, but then how well do we manage this? You don't get that. So what we need is, a lot of commitment on. It's easy to always blame the government, and the government has a share in the blame. But I think that even when inadequate resources eventually get to specific universities, specific colleges of education and polytechnics, those who head these institutions ought to transparently and accountably manage these resources.